Lord, we ask you bless our study today as we look to the past and as we also look to the future. Teach us, Lord, to be like many were facing challenges and things that really rock the boat for both their world and their church. But Lord, you have seen them through, and may we see that consistency you have as the Lord of your church in all that we do. When we face challenges, that you will see us through too. We pray this all in Jesus' name. Amen. That van here, just to look at that, that's pretty interesting. I got to meet the guy because he was the first administrator for World Missions. Two guys that were pastors hopped in that thing. We'll talk about it a little bit, and drove around Africa. And to hear firsthand from him some of the stories of the breakdown and the rainy season and the roads that were impassable, and they slept in this, they ate in this. This was their kitchen, their bunk quarters. This is the adventurous spirit of some who preceded us is pretty amazing. And so we'll learn a little bit about why this happened and what was the initiative behind it too. So as we continue with this emphasis of Christ through us, that the book was actually, I read it was like 35, 40 pages last night. Just read it as a review. We'll just hit some of the highlights, and so what we'll do is we'll talk about some of the individual people that had a big impact, and we'll talk about some of the situations. One of the big things that we'll talk about today is in the discussion of the breaking of the synodical conference, and with leaving Missouri Synod, and there was the ELS that joined the CLC that broke earlier, and we'll talk a little bit about that today too, because we still sit in that, but that was in the early 60s, and it kind of impacted my family in a unique way too. We can share some of that, and maybe some of you have some stories to share. So let's just begin with President John Brenner, and the scary thing is his son looks so much like him, who was one of my professors at the seminary. How kind of generationally, I'm like, that genetic pool did not fall, that apple did not fall far from the tree. And this ended up being my brother-in-law's pastor too, but he served the synod for a long time. He became the new president, and he did a lot of things. From 1908 to 58, Brenner served at St. John's Lutheran in Milwaukee. During his ministry, Brenner served WELS on many boards and projects. He was huge into publications, English-speaking stuff. So some of the big things that happened from World War II is that we were really, really pushing towards English-speaking, English outreach, the shift from gathering together fellow Germans coming over the ocean and gathering together into churches to let's do outreach with English, both in our schools and our churches. He was one of the many proponents of the use of English in publications too, and that was a good thing, because then with publications, much like Martin Luther found when the printing press came along the same time, you could get word out, and when you print it in the language to be understood, why Martin Luther did the translation of the Bible into German, which united the German language, was because he wanted it in the hands of the people. And so publications was a huge thing that needed to happen so that you could get the message out. And in those days, print publications where everyone was thirsty for news. We didn't have, a cell phone that would blast you with, you'd have to search the internet to find the news angle you want. It was not like that. And so we're on the beginning of that. He was the president for quite some time, 20 years, before he stepped down and passed the baton on through some right before the interesting times that the synod faced, and helped navigate the synod through interchurch relations, all leading up to the split. So he was very much involved in working back and forth between representatives from both synods and those concerns there. Another organization that rose at this time too is Ladies' Aid. We call it Mission Society here, and it was amazing what these organizations were huge. Women, by and large, after World War II, all the guys came back, many stayed at home. It was that building generation of our nation. And some stayed in the workplace because they had to when guys were gone at war and they were taking over. Some didn't. They stayed home, the family and children. This was the mission hand and the supporting hand of the churches were found in these. When you look at some of the old pictures, I'm like, holy cow, how did you get that many women of that multi-generational age together just hanging out? But some of the things they did at a time when most women did not work outside the homes, the Ladies' Aid provided an opportunity for women in the congregation to gather for fellowship, Bible study, and service activities. Many Ladies' Aid groups generously gave financial support to the congregation and synod. Huge. Some of the stuff they did to help with the congregation. It was not always behind the scenes, but it was just where they put their mind to it, and they helped with major things. There was a Ladies' Aid organization that raised enough to build and dedicate an organ. They were really, really active, and they were doing things that couldn't always be done. They saw the need and they addressed it. It was a huge part of the growing church body, because some of these churches grew very, very large, very fast, and you had one or two pastors or even a shortage of pastors. It was a very, very important organization that was very, very, and today we try to I know in the Lament, I served on the Lutheran Women's Missionary Society as spiritual growth pastor for about 4 years, and it was always how do we get the next generation? It's harder because it's different. This came about because a lot didn't work out of the home, and this was a great way to get together, and that for both social and spiritual. Now the challenge is most work out of the home, and how do we shift gears to still have that not that it has to be men doing this and women doing that, but some organizations were there for the time, and they served, and we still have these organizations, but generationally it's always a challenge when you try to pass the baton on. World War II in the Wisconsin Synod, this is where we had to shift gears a little bit too, as far as how we did ministry. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, there was a little debate about the need to join World War II, unlike World War I. So it wasn't a doctrinal issue. Is this a war that we can, with good conscience, go and fight? This was where they attacked our soil, and that was the defining factor. There was little resistance to the draft as World War I, where there was a nationalism where people were enlisting, even some lying about their age, to go and serve. And it'll hit our congregations too. While there was still anti-German prejudice, WELS had increasingly become an English language denomination. There was less friction over language than in World War I. It was like some congregations, it was almost splitting them, or they had to do separate services. They had to do things differently because the German language was a unifying thing. It was the thing that kept us connected to the mother country, and they weren't going to let that go. And sometimes it was a generational struggle. The kids are speaking English, learning English, but grandma, grandpa, and so they're bilingual, gradually becoming just English speaking. WELS avoided formal interactions with the government, and that was unlike some controversial approaches in World War I. So we stayed in our lane and didn't have to say and do some things that the World War I generation did. And this is some other things. 22,000 Wisconsin Synod members were in the armed services. If you can imagine, that's when armed forces, now we talk about we have too many leaders and generals and the like too, because our fighting force has gone down to more strategic, where they're just a different way you did war. Where if you look at World War II, when they staged the D-Day invasion, it was basically, we're going to throw more bodies than bullets at you, and we will eventually overwhelm you. It'll be wave after wave after wave after wave, and the generals, and that was how they overwhelmed the Germans. It was seriously by their guns were overheating. Their bullets, they blocked the trains from behind. They ran out of supplies, but it was because so many people were coming, and that's the way the armed forces were. And 22,000 people now were going, and young people going into war. They were drafted and trained quickly and given a gun and said, go. And so now how do you serve those that are not in the pews anymore, not on the farm anymore? And so let's talk a little bit about how to minister to all these that were part of our congregation and are not and abroad, and they're all over the world, the different theaters. And so they had to deal with this head on because it's a big issue. WELS developed this Spiritual Welfare Commission, and this was something we did on our own uniquely, and what it did was produce and send things to soldiers directly because of this. In the World War II, the Wisconsin Synod, the chaplain program, the WELS rejected participating in the chaplain program, where in World War I it was a little differently managed, and through the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, we had chaplains in the armed services serving in the different theaters, and where there was large, there weren't always the forward positions, but in the large service positions in the back, they would have chaplains that would go and can serve. But we ran into some issues, and we didn't agree with the Missouri Synod on this. They would say, we will look past a few things that were doctrinal concerns, so that the greater need or the greater love would be to serve our men no matter the cost. And so the government was paying the pastors, so they took over the chaplaincy program, and they started paying the chaplains. And that was a concern too, say, well, who are they responsible? Who actually called them now? They're not called, how does this work? And the government expects that if they pay you, they have you do this, and that is your marching order. So how do we even voice if you're asked to do something that doctrinally you're like, and so that was a big concern. The other one is who calls and oversees the chaplains, who organizes them. If it's the government is now saying, if you're going to be embedded with the troops or going over, and we're going to pay you, and so you are under how does that work pastorally? That's a big challenge, right? And then required to commune and work with those outside of our fellowship, where as a chaplain, you were asked to serve a Methodist as a Methodist, you were asked to serve a Catholic as a Catholic, you were asked to serve outside of, and this was the very thing that many had come across an ocean to avoid, that forced, and so you're supposed to put on a different hat, and some were even so much as to try and serve someone that's Jewish as a Jew. And I'm like, how do I even do that? And nowadays it'd be like, how does a chaplain serve someone who is like New Earthy or something? You come and like burn sage and chants. I wouldn't even know how to do it. And the chaplains in the prison, I end up dealing with them a lot in visitation, and I've asked several of them, if you meet the new one, I'm like, how do you even do that? And they have to be very universal in their approach to their ministry, and doctrine becomes something that is important when it's important, but not always. Does that make sense? Where it's like you have to say, well, I'm only doing what's they asked me to do this, and I'm willing to do that. And I'm like, so that was what we didn't want our chaplains to experience. And then the Missouri Synod participating in the chaplain program, unlike World War I, was raising concerns in the WELS that they did participate. The greater need was our boys are out there, our ladies are out there. We need to serve them. And I know it's not ideal, and I know that it's going to cause us to compromise sometimes, but the greater law of love dictates that we need to do this. And so they participated in this, and we kind of went, and so that was one of the things that became a rising tension between the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod and the Wisconsin Synod and other smaller synods with us too. So any questions on that? Just let's continue on. In World War and the Wisconsin Synod, building projects at churches and schools were nearly impossible. And part of that was just even everyone was rationing. Everyone was, with all the supplies that were going towards, all the metal, everything was going toward the war effort. I mean, I remember my grandma would talk about this too, having grown up, and she was young in the Depression years, and coming off of all the financial things that were just, and this is actually I don't know if Pastor McKinney talked about last time, how much of going into the Depression years, how much of a financial, it was like, $3 per communicant member. We were in debt like millions, and we didn't have the base that Missouri Synod had, like the number of people. We were smaller, and so some of those first presidents and were trying to balance outreach with paying debt, where we didn't want to be we want to be good stewards, that we weren't just managing debt and always just throwing money forward. How do we pay back what we owe? And there was a swing that came post World War II that we were able to pay everything back, and then it was like we had money to go. And then there's a problem of, okay, we have money to go, do we have enough workers to do it? And so they're always like chasing this circular thing. We have mission dollars now, we don't have men and women to do it. Well, we got to have schools to train them. well, our schools are way underprepared for this many people coming. We need to build buildings in our schools so we can prepare for the future growth that's going to come as we recruit people for the ministry. And then as we grow, then we'll go and send them out. And then we'll have people sitting on the bench again because we have so many people that were going out. My sister, when she graduated, she was getting married, so she didn't get a call. And many of her, and even my brother-in-law, who went to the seminary, like 3 people on his when they graduate from the seminary, sit on the bench, not receiving a call on call day for several months, some of them even 6 months, just doing secular work, even though they're trained to, because of that cycle where it's just, we never have the perfect numbers. And one of the things that was happening now is we're realizing that a lot of these initial efforts, the Lord was blessing, and churches and schools and synodical schools, they needed to build. And it was at a time when resources were short. If you talk of like, sometimes I've seen it before, like if we would have built the church 2 years later, we'd have paid like $1.2 million more, because it's like timing is everything. But I've noticed that it usually doesn't go the other direction, where if it's going to get cheaper in a year, and so they're facing this at the same time, and foreign mission work was delayed. The doors were open all over the place after World War II, and borders were open, things that you couldn't do before, the advancement in transportation and all the things that came with a war that just focuses technology. Oh my goodness, there was so many opportunities, but not the funding or the manpower. Enrollment at the ministerial schools experienced some decline. And some of it was they wanted to keep their boys home and the like, and do the work and grow the nation and family and all these types of things coming back. And part of it, we just hadn't pushed among our people the importance of mission zeal. And then most congregations suffered the loss of members in battle. That is a very real thing. Where, and I think, like, you think of Ukraine right now, I can't even imagine how they're going to have a population where there are going to be way more women than men, if they're even around there, just because of what war does. And our congregation sent 22,000 out, not 22,000 came back. And so they suffered a loss of leaders and the next generation, and all these, young men that were, very much at the prime of life. And so that really impacted us too. This is where, at the end of something that they wrote in the Northwestern Lutheran, we are happy that in the 1945 the war came to an end, that our boys have come home and are coming home, and that we can again devote ourselves to the pursuits of peace. Let us give all credit for it to God, who, for Jesus' sake, has not looked upon our sins and has showered us with his undeserved blessing. And let us in the days of peace forget the lessons which the war should never have taught us. Let's move forward now, and the economy, or I say our nations were at rest, that were warring. Our nation was at peace, and this is when prosperity happens. And in that environment, let's go. So, in what ways did the World War II affect the Wisconsin Synod? Most tensions seen as World War I did not reappear in the major ways. WELS still kept the commitment to serving the spiritual needs to its service members outside the government chaplain program. Ministry activity was hampered by wartime restrictions and upheaval, and Americans adopted a more global mindset that WELS channeled into missions after the war. So it was not just local congregations or going to areas where you saw an opportunity, or having those circuit riders go because some more immigrants had, conjugated together, bought land, and were moving out in the frontier. It was not just our nation, although we'll learn what happened, even our little synod, how we were not in every state that was developed, and it was more of a global approach. We want to do stuff over oceans too, even though we were small. Any thoughts or questions on any of that? Kind of going fast, but world missions is always exciting and interesting, and just maybe give you this. I'm getting old. Because it dovetails into people that I knew, and the guy that you'll see here, Haneke, was the first. He was a missionary that went over to go into Africa to find out what mission fields were open, because a lot of churches are doing the same thing, going into what area is untouched is kind of what they were trying to find. And then also he came back and became the first administrator for world missions for our synod, and then it was Tate Sauer, and then my dad served in that capacity for as many years as God blessed him before he had a blood disorder and and he had to step down and died soon after. So he was only 61. But at the time that he was in the Reagan years, so when my father served, and I got to talk to all these guys that were before him and ask questions about that vehicle, you saw that went through Africa. I can't even imagine. You talk about tough travel and unknowns around every corner. Just the adventurous spirit to get out there. And it wasn't just to Apache land, it was to Africa, it was to Asia. And these were in tougher times where I don't remember if this vehicle even had air conditioning. I don't think it did. It was just windows. That was not something. And that's one of the things that happened as far as even going to like the South in Arizona and Texas. When air conditioning happened, a lot of people started moving there and retiring, and so that became mission fields, all because of air conditioning. And having lived down south, I heard the opposite. They said, you know what ruined the South? The culture of the South would sit around, and in the middle of the day when it's hot, they would sit on the porch. They'd always find a shady area. They would enjoy tea and all that kind of stuff and be social. So they'd work really, really early, middle of the afternoon. Later, as the sun's going down and go to bed, they said the pace of the North, which everything go, 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 right, and air conditioning. Said those two things ruined the culture of the South. Having lived on that, was kind of interesting how, and then everyone just gathered indoors, and no longer was that like getting together with neighbors and taking time in the middle of the day, cooking outside because it was too hot in the kitchen, all those things that were very, very Southern, the way they designed their houses, the way they managed the workflow, and everyone said, everyone is so slow, it takes forever. And I was, man, try to do a building project in the South. I'm like, what is it with you guys? It's not that you don't even show up, you don't care. How long does it take to do a road? Look at how big that equipment is, just drive it. And it was just such a different pace. And it's not right or wrong, but I'm like, it took 4 days for someone to show up, just to check the electric so we could move out of the hotel and into our house because you had to inspect it, and that was something that we would deal with when these missionaries went over. You go to third world, and you have to bring your own parts that break down on these vehicles along because you can't get them there. You have to bring extra tires and fix the tires on the road, cranking this thing up on uneven ground. The roads were good sometimes, but then filled with ruts in the rainy season. They were just mud pits other times. You had to go across rivers that did not have bridges. And so you had to wade out there to see with all that's floating in the water. You don't know if it's a V like this or whatever. Can I drive this across? And try to ask natives that spoke French and some tribal languages and the like to try to communicate. Can I get across this with a vehicle? Because you saw tire tracks, but you hope down the river you don't see a bunch of vehicles swamped. And this is the kind of stuff they were facing as that zeal. So here's Haneke, very, very interesting man. Vastly increased opportunities resulting in many ways from the present war. These are opportunities, the grave responsibilities, not of reconstruction, but of the regeneration by the gospel. Very much as we have what the world needs. If the world has discovered peace by putting down their arms, we have a peace the world needs that is eternal. And that zeal really pushed some people. This is a parish pastor, not a trained, multilingual, not the guys you see that say, this is how you survive in the jungle, right? You eat a bat or something like that. You see these shows where these guys are adventure. These aren't the guys that are trained in special forces. These are pastors from Midwest congregations that say, we're going to take 6 months off from our full family, wife, kids, and we're going to go and do this exploration to see where the gospel might be needed. And so, rebuilding ties with Germany happened also. This was some of the letters that were written about what was going on in Germany because of the devastation that finally crippled the Germans. Well, we had kind of severed ties because of World War II and just the whole idea of, anti-German sentiment. But these people were related. I mean, these are grandmas and grandpas and aunts and uncles. These are their cousins and they had worn different uniforms and stuff. So this is what happened. A German Lutheran wrote to a WELS pastor who had once served him in Germany. My elder son fell on the battlefield. My daughter with their 3 children are missing. Pastor Thilke is said to be wounded, but we do not know where his family is. About the losses of his parish, I still cannot report, as most of our brethren have their homes lost or heavily damaged by bombs and are now dispersed to the 4 winds. I am searching for them all. All our churches are demolished. Last time we had services at my dwelling, I have lost everything. So basically, they had gone down to just doing church in his house because they had, and that church right there, you see, the Lutheran church, here's what it looked like because of the firebombing that was going on. I just met someone who is an au pair now for one of our members, and Emily, she lives in Dresden, and you still, when you drive into this amazing train station, and that's where people hid during the firebombing of Dresden. It's crazy, but you still see burn marks and charred marks, and you look at the cathedral, although it's in time, as where they rebuilt the cathedral, they left the old bricks because they went and they the old bricks and the new bricks. You can see how devastated the building was because of the contrast between the new and old bricks, that the firebombing, and this affected the congregations in Germany. They're the ones sending over missionaries. They're the ones that were sending over money. They were the ones training pastors and saying, do outreach here. And now you got to look back, kind of like the Apostle Paul saying, can we give you're the new churches here, but the widows in Jerusalem are going without food because of the famine there, and so this is an opportunity where we rebuilt relations, and this is where WELS frequently sent over official visitors to assess the needs of Germany, established a mission to aid refugees and fellow Lutherans recovering from the war. In 1946, care, clothing, and food packages were sent, as well as copies of the Gemeindeblatt and other printed materials. So we sent them printed materials. This is where a lot of ladies' aid organizations would gather together and do things and send them back for, here's just some of those things where you're giving just basic clothes and blankets and other things, sending them back to serve those that had lost everything in the war. Because now Germany was tasked not only with rebuilding its country, but reparations for the war, and that was just devastating, and it affected and the churches there too. And it's not just there; it's Russia. If you're a student of any kind of World War II, Russia, and they had even this scorched earth policy. So Russia, as it was retreating, would burn all its fields so that the Germans wouldn't be able to have their fields. And so, that unfortunately, when they won the war, there was a lot of devastation they had to rebuild. So Russia too released from Russian captivity. These are people in prisoner of war camps. We were helping people also in these Japanese concentration camps. We were sending materials and trying to send resources to serve the people that were even in prisoner of war things, just to give them encouragement. And so during the war and after the war too, we didn't forget. A strong mission emphasis, you'll see this in all the publications. It's really to push out. The Northwestern Lutheran had it on the front page. This is our mission. And this is, I want to just show you the mission fields of our synod. So we went from Wisconsin, Michigan, and you see 2 in Nigeria, 3 in Rhodesia, 4 in Germany, and then also we sent to Japan. It seems like, oh my goodness, the enemies that are the ones we send missionaries to. Isn't that kind of crazy? The ones you were just having arms against, where you drop bombs on to cripple, you had to cripple the enemy. Now we send missionaries to go and serve those who had been devastated in this war. So home missions, let's talk a few minutes about that and some fun stuff to that, and then we'll talk about world missions. The post-war period saw explosive growth in new home missions and building projects, even in population too of our country, and so we went to some of those areas. You see Manitowoc. Home missions, this is all related to that Manitowoc Church became a hub, and it was one that helped daughter other congregations. You have, this one is in Manitowoc. Again, they just keep building bigger buildings to serve where they grow out of the small ones and grow to bigger ones. This is maybe what a small church. We had kind of a template that we build, and it went. And in my early days, my dad was a missionary. At first, it was in Waukesha County, though. We built, and they called them a WEF, worship, education, and fellowship. You did it all in one room. So you'd have like the kitchen in the same room as the whatever, and maybe they have like this accordion wall you'd pull to kind of separate to make classrooms. And they said, let's build this. It's very utilitarian, but I will say to this, aesthetically, and when you outgrow it, it's like really hard to like, what do I do with this big box with bathrooms? And how do I? And so they'd like build a church over it, and then this would become like a central. And it was just the architect, just a funny story, this is after this, but we were still in the building expansion because we had 10 of my class were sent out to be home missionaries. So we were starting 10 churches just out of the graduating class from the seminary, which is very hard to do now. We don't have class numbers that size. and that you'd have 10 people that all called to start a church from scratch. That was pretty unique. And with that, then, synod had a certain amount of dollars are pushing you towards a template. And the guy, when we were starting to build in Verona, that was responsible, he had retired, was responsible for designing the WEF unit. He said he wanted to put his hat in, or his design in. As one of the architects we interviewed. And into the committee, I said, okay, we got 5 different architects and this guy. I submitted his letter to be considered, and I said, I'm putting it on the bottom of the stack. I said, if all else fails, we'll go to this, but let's not start there because I grew up in a WEF unit and I don't want to go anywhere near one. But this is just serving the need. My dad started one of the churches in Phoenix, Arizona, and he was called out of the seminary to do that. And they started out with something that looked almost identical to this in the inside. They all kind of had the same thing with the central altar. They had the hymn boards, all long nave, maybe some gathering area if they were blessed. They didn't have a bathroom indoors when they first started out. That had to come later. They had to go across the street. They had a single 1/4-inch pipe of the main water coming, just cold water coming to the church. And then they had a pit system, and then they finally got sewer out to them, and that's when the bathroom we put in the building. That was starting in 1962. My dad got called out of the seminary to start a mission in Phoenix, Arizona. So this is kind of a decade or two after this, but very interesting history. This is Janesville, real close to us. That church still is extant today, and redesigned and remodeled umpteen times. But then we're gonna talk about Arizona became a retirement place. People would go that had certain ailments, and so Arizona was becoming as big of an area with number of churches as like a Milwaukee, where that area in there, Tucson and Phoenix and all that, and with the mission work going on with the Apache, there was a lot of population moving there because of the climate, and we served them that way too. So Arizona became this big place we went and started churches, a lot of them. Let's talk world missions for a couple minutes, and then we can get to some other specifics. This is where the Synodical Conference had a long history of mission work in the United States. Our unique one was Apache land, but there was a lot of other missionary work done by Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. We're still together with them. And now, in the 1930s, the Synodical Conference initiated mission work in Nigeria, and we were part of that. And this was a big mission effort. And world missions in South Africa in 1949, 2 middle-aged pastors volunteered to leave behind their families and congregation for 3 months to embark on the exploratory mission. These are the 2 guys, Haneke and Wacker, in 1949. And they actually, their travels, they went 8,000 miles on a ship to get to what is it in Africa? What's that? Nope, it's at Cape, what is it? Cape Town. Ugh. Cape Town. They landed there, so they did 8,000 miles in a boat with this big truck along with them, and then they did 4,000 miles. We'll look here. I'm just going to see if they have this here. No, it wouldn't. I guess they don't have the map. Maybe they'll come later. They did 4,000 miles in that truck. I can't even imagine. We did 27 hours straight coming back from the Tetons, and had everyone in the car drive twice, and I was so done by the time we do that. I can't imagine every day cranking through that's on highways and having rest areas and restaurants ready to serve you. None of that, right? So the mission zeal was unbelievable. And through the tireless efforts of gifted missionaries, Wisconsin endeavors to confess Christ in foreign lands, and we're blessed. So we were right along with the Missouri Synod doing this in a smaller way because we were smaller. And we'd sent off a missionary to Japan, and that was another place that was very, very hard because the Asian culture, and the religion are so intertwined in Japan, and the language is not easy. One of my classmates with Dan Haben grew up. His dad was a missionary to Japan, and so he was bilingual. Kind of interesting. His brother Dan was the same way. And when he would start talking Japanese, kind of funny because people they would come to. I was at Disney with him, and people that come to visit America that are Japanese do not expect people to know fluent Japanese at all because it's so rare. And these people were talking Japanese behind us, and he's listening to them, and he turns around and started talking fluent Japanese, and they were just like, "Who are you?" Because they couldn't believe. It was a really tough language and a really tough culture, but we had some initial growth right off the bat. and it was starting out with military that was stationed there, because we did have base and stuff there, but it expanded into, and they had some immediate growth. And you had to learn Japanese, and then they did a ton, using local people that they'd brought into the church, did a ton of brochures and other things that would bless the mission work that were written in the native Japanese. Arizona, and here's another thing, just to kind of go full circle. St. Paul's involved in that too. Pastor Hordell was a pastor here, and he took a call from here to go to Japan and serve that mission. Our missions have dwindled in Japan. It's becoming culturally harder and harder to gain traction in Japan, and becoming more and more expensive, and just it's a snail pace growth, because people have to leave family and culture to become. It's like pulling someone out of Mormonism. And so the mission work there has dwindled, and the excitement when the West was there, and we had a lot more people, and they were looking for peace and hope after their country had just been devastated. It was a great ripe field. It's been harder in days now that the mission work there has kind of dwindled, but we had a huge surge coming off the beginning. Arizona, California district, the Apache mission. The congregations in Arizona, the new mission in California, gathered in February 1954 to organize the Arizona, California district. It's hard to believe that we didn't even have much of a representation in California and Arizona. And so it was 1954 when we finally said they're their own district. And the new district could count 30,000 baptized members served by 27 pastors. So that got big quick. And it was how the nation moved, and we just responded to that growth. This is a congregation standing in front of the Tucson mission. By 1960, there were nearly 9,000 baptized members, in 1946 in the congregations. And then we also, the southern states were just not, and the hot states were just not as prevalent. It was a long way away, and there was always a sensitivity, let's not overgrow our britches. And so it had to be where we had a mission that was ready to stand on its own 2 feet, and then we didn't have enough pastors to send that, and we're always kind of replacing and serving our own. And so even in the nation, it was hard to expand into these outer-lying areas over mountains. Please.
What's a preaching station?
So a preaching station would be that you don't have an organized, so a pastor would like serve a congregation, and they'd go during the week, and they would go and meet with like 3 families meeting in a house. Or in my case, when I was down in Georgia, I would go down an hour and a half, and we'd meet in a hotel conference area, and it would be like 6 or 7 people that would gather together, and we'd preach, and we'd do Sunday school, I'd do catechism class with the kids. And so a preaching station is not a church, but you were serving as a pastor, kind of like a circuit rider, but with a car, not a horse. And then you would have people to gather, because it was because of military, and it was a huge base. Warner Robins base was there, and so you would be serving them in a small group, but it was considered a preaching station. Yep, they were WELS members that were just 2 hours away from the closest church. I dissolved that preaching station and had them come up, and they would drive, sometimes stay in a hotel, sometimes stay at our house if they come the next day, and got their kids involved in Sunday school. And because I said, we need your, and they were willing. Both, he was the lieutenant colonel at Warner Robins, and then there were some others, retired military. They'd drive up and be a part of our mission, because I said, we need you guys to be leaders in our mission. And so they would drive 4 hours to church, and sometimes stay overnight, use frequent flyer or hotel points to stay in a hotel if it was like something they want to do. And we get the kids involved. We'd have them over for lunch after, because then you didn't have to worry about that. It was a very moving thing, but that's a preaching station. Not yet a church, but a gathering of believers. I did it in Texas too, my vicar year. We had to drive like 3 hours into the wilderness of Texas, where they'd actually have a sign saying, "Fill up here, because we don't know if you'll make it to the next gas station." You went to, and there was like a house with like 12 people, and then you'd come back. It's pretty cool as a pastor. Yeah, yep. And so a lot start out as preaching stations, because the mission board hasn't deemed that to be an area that is going to serve, that a church could, because it demographically and stuff like this, but we have members. It's changed now, because you can serve so much by the internet and go less often for Lord's Supper. And so that call for that isn't as prevalent. So, but yeah, good question. Let's go on to expansion of Florida. No one was allowed by synod decree to start a church in Florida. It was still uncharted area, and with air conditioning, Florida became way more popular for retirees, and it was land untouched, and it was just this building expansion. If you go down there, you see houses built in a certain era, a ton of them. all small, one-car garage or no garage, because that was with just a little car port. And now you pay $600,000 for these, 1,100 square foot homes, because it was in that area. It was just expanding with growth, and people in the pews saw this and said, "Why aren't we going down there?" Well, Synod was sensitive with all the world efforts and stuff, with the purse strings and the manpower. Let's not do this. So, in February 1954, a snowbird member of the Michigan District's Mission Board invited the 3 pastors on the board for an exploratory trip to Florida. For 8 days, they traveled 1,400 miles in this car. The Michigan District Mission Board acted quickly, and several congregations were established by the end of the decade. So they just went down there and said, "We're going to do this. We're going to support it ourselves." And there was a little tension with Synod saying, "You're not following our directive." And it's like, come on. We went down there and we're like, how can we not have people? We did it as local congregations in a small area of a state and said, we're going to do this. And St. Petersburg is where we were vacationing. So I've been to the church that they started, still going, although there's a bigger church that's next door with a school. And this church refuses to dissolve into the bigger church, even though it's dwindling and doesn't have its own pastor, but that was when it started out in St. Petersburg, the first church. And pastors from Cucaulin, Michigan, went down there, which is where my brother-in-law grew up. So I learned now, a friend of ours, that my friend's wife, it was her grandpa that started all this in Michigan, and went down and started exploratory work. And so this is where you're not working against each other. It's just, we can do this too. And this is something that started Florida, and Florida just expanded dramatically. So, where did the Synod focus its mission efforts in the post-war? Home missions, Midwest, West, Florida. World missions was Germany, West and Central Africa, and Japan. Okay. Now we're going to go to, and so I'm going to give a little time for this too, kind of what happened in the early '60s. This would be when my dad came out of the seminary in 1962. He decided not to vicar and went straight to start a church in Phoenix, Arizona. And then was involved with the Apache mission out there too, as his first call, and that's where my sisters were born. And so this is part of the move out west, and the starting of the Arizona-California district. And then this is the president that came and served that. It's funny because his it would be, let's see, twin grandsons were my classmates in Oscar Naumann, all the way through. Still, they were in my wedding and all that kind of stuff. So it's kind of interesting now. I'm looking at these pictures going, oh yeah. I'm getting old because I'm knowing these people now. He was a professor, elected president. He was an awesome guy, very temperate, that was able to help navigate during a really tough time in the breakup of the Synodical Conference. His leadership saw WELS through the suspension of fellowship with the Missouri Synod, as well as ambitious programs such as Every State by '78. That was we were going to get to every single state with a congregation by 1978, and they just put it in front of them, and they did. But it was almost just like, all right, we got 4 months to go. Let's plant something in Alabama. They said we're going to be in every state by '78, and that was a huge mission initiative to push our congregations to not just get comfortable, but to get out. Building boom in the 50s. They marked the largest building boom in the history of the Wisconsin Synod, from college campus to preparatory high schools, from churches to day schools. It was just huge. The population bloomed too, and the opportunity for education was there. Everyone had kids. It was that come home from war, and all of a sudden, boom, the baby boomer generation. And we had to build schools too, because they were getting inundated. As we encouraged people to think ministry, those schools had to have nice dorms. And so what was going on in New Ulm, what was going on in Watertown here, what was going on in Michigan Lutheran Seminary, huge building programs, millions of dollars spent. And it was also, they had one in Mobridge, South Dakota. I didn't really think about this until last night, but in my family, between my parents and us kids, my dad went to high school in the high school they had in Minnesota, in New Ulm, and then went to Northwestern College. And then my mom went to Mobridge, South Dakota. They had the school, the WELS school there. And then she did the emergency course, the Winnebago course, for 2 years because they needed teachers. So she was at the Winnebago Academy, which was just up here, just northern Wisconsin. And that's where my mom and dad met when he was at the seminary. And then one of my sisters graduated from Michigan Lutheran Seminary. Another sister went there for 2 years and then went to Luther Prep School. And my other sister went to Martin Luther Preparatory School in Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin, which was one of our pre-ministerial encouragement high schools, and then I went to Northwestern Prep in college, and one sister graduated from DMLC, which was the teacher training college. And so our family had gone to every synod school that had a dorm. In just the 6 of us, we'd actually been on campus, been through, trained by every single synod school, which cracks me up. I don't know if we're rare in that. But this was the time when all that was booming, and we were just kind of catching up to where our growth needed us to be, and it's growing pains in a good way. Let's talk a little bit now. Any other questions on that? We're going through just a lot of exciting times. But in those are challenging times. There was things that happened in Japan that were hard, where a missionary steps down. There's going to be some things happening now in this history where it's real tough, even between families, where you're talking like brothers and the ministry, or people that were classmates, and this is really tough. And it came at the first year my dad was out in the ministry, and it came in his home congregation in Mankato, whether they're going to stay with Missouri Synod or go to Wisconsin Synod. All these things are going on in our family pre-me. But it's interesting to hear them speak of it. So breaking with the Missouri Synod, our relationship started to fracture. One of those things was the chaplaincy program, that they decided to do that. And so they began the fellowship talks with the American Lutheran Church, which my aunt and uncle were ALC members, because that was all they had in Red Wing, South Dakota. And then I'll just summarize it this quickly. The bigger is better. That we get together. The greater need is we get out with, and so let's not discuss and talk about things that aren't the first thing when it comes to mission work, but they are. And so there was discussions there, and we're like, this is not a healthy discussion. You're putting aside important doctrines that unite us, or making them less as a priority to do more together. And those discussions, like, whoa, cease and desist. It's not that we can't talk together, but you're already doing things together in the anticipation that we'll come to doctrinal unity, which you shouldn't be doing together until you have doctrinal unity. Does that make sense? Where they're already like praying together and doing this. Well, we're thinking towards the future, and like, let's be careful, because then we lose sight of the thing that unites us. Let's have God's word in between us, and when we come to an agreement on this, let's agree on this, and then everything flows from that. The LCMS fully embraced the chaplain program, which we talked about, and the LCMS reversed the stance against scouting. That was a big deal, and still is, because of what scouting does, although scouting has backtracked and done some things, although then now they've neutered themselves to the point where they don't even have a religious underpinning. It's so universally and morally diverse. The big thing with the scouting, just to summarize it, was they allowed people to stand side by side and make an oath to whatever God they want to fill in the blank for. And then it was always that you would do things as a good turn, where it was teaching that the morality and the things you did to serve that idea of God were a good towards Him. And we're saying that teaches a theology that is not Christian theology. It's like taking the Bible and saying, we're holding these principles, but we're throwing out the Bible and allowing you to figure out what you want to do, and its work righteousness is encouraged. And it sounds kind of nitpicky, but it's, why am I doing this? To do a good turn for God. No, I'm doing this because of what God did for me, and it's who I am, and that's why I do what I do. But you didn't have that opportunity to teach Christ in the scouting troops, because you had to let everyone have their own idea of the higher power. And finally, divergence on the question, is prayer fellowship? And a lot say, no, it's not. We're just praying together towards God that He give us unity. But really, prayer is worship, right? And prayer for the unbeliever bounces back down with I always say it's the ceiling of sin. But the prayer of the believer reaches our Father's ears and is pleasing to Him, because it's our act of worship. It's us talking back to Him. And so we always have to keep that in that context. Scouting was the Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts of America, and it was having these organizations that were, this is the hard part, they were a religious organization underneath that ranking in the government, and they would work with churches and local groups and do it. The problem is their theology, it became kind of a theology that would trickle in, and we're saying, you're having our kids take a stand together with other kids towards whatever they define as God, so you're standing side by side, and you're teaching this we do this as a good turn. And it was more of you get all these rewards and patches and different things because you're doing it good. And we're saying, be who you are. teach these things, but don't try to mix up theology. It's a bad tasting soup. And we're saying, let's not do that. Not that what they weren't doing wasn't good, to teach people how to tie knots and to hunt and fish and all these things that they taught, very practical. But let's get theology out of it. They didn't want to do that. And so then the Missouri Synod said, we'll have troops in our own congregation and we'll manage that, but you're still part of an organization that doesn't do that. So you're just saying, well, we control our local troop, but it became even more of an issue later on when they were taking more and more diverse stances, when society was putting pressure on with morality and other things too, and still today. So does that help?
Yeah, I didn't realize there was ever a connection between Boy Scouts and
Yes, and it was just how churches deal with this organization, and it was considered a religious organization under this classification. And we came with Lutheran Boy and Girl Pioneers was our answer to do it ourselves. And then underlying issue in an erosion of the doctrine of the Word of God in the LCMS, and we see this again and again as it was harder and harder to come to agreement on doctrine on several things. And prayer was one of them, but it was more than that. It was a fellowship with other denominations. And so these were just symptoms. It's like a different spirit, and it was hard because our conventions didn't line up. And so we would come to this and we would present this and say, well, you got to give us time to react. And it's 3 years later before they came to convention. And so you're doing this is like an 8-year spread from where the controversy was starting to boil up and where they actually could make a definitive voted on decision. And so the Breaking with Missouri Synod, Edmund Ream wrote a series of articles in Northwestern Lutheran, Where Do We Stand?, to better bring the issues going into the Missouri Synod to light among the WELS members. We wanted everyone to understand this. It wasn't just the talking heads at Synod and in the Synod training schools. This was a congregational level. In the 1952 convention, the Synodical Conference turned ugly when Missouri Synod delegates booed and shouted down President Brenner because he was bringing up that issue, and it was a toxic convention, very, very sad. And it wasn't that we didn't educate people. They put these pamphlets out to be in the pews and with people on all the different things that are breaking down what we had for almost 100 years, that joint synodical conference of working together. So in 1955, WELS Convention resolution to break fellowship was defeated. Then Ream, he was, and some others eventually left. The CLC left at that time too, saying, we're not doing this fast enough. And there was pressure to stay and see and wait with hope that we'll resolve this, and some saw this, no, the writing is on the wall, and I'm making this quick history, but they left early and left the Synodical Conference, and the WELS, the ELS and the WELS stayed longer until that final convention and vote was made, and they wanted to keep the doors open in the dialogue with LCMS, and finally, the sterner kind of admonition and love was what the call was, that they stayed. What is the main point of the break with Missouri Synod? Let's just go through those. Disagreement on the proper application of the doctrine of fellowship in many areas. Erosion of the authority of the Bible in the Missouri Synod institutions. WELS concerns not being adequately responded to over many years. And this is some of the things that happened with that. In 1960, disunity on the scriptural teaching of the church fellowship was clear. The Wisconsin Synod maintained that there must be agreement in doctrine before expressions of agreement can take place. Biblical fellowship doesn't exist without unity in teaching. We call it the unit concept. We're all in. Let's come to an agreement on everything God teaches, and then we express that unity in what we do together. Rather than saying, it's popular to say, we have 7 things we got to agree on, and then everything else is up to you. It's a personal faith thing, and those are lesser. And we're saying, no, everything is important. Let's focus on that and come to agreement. Then we work together. And the Missouri Synod countered by saying that there was partial agreement, that some actions of fellowship like prayer could take place, and impasse was declared. And finally the breaking, the crisis came to a climax at 61. Werner Frosman of the Wisconsin Synod explained the motion to suspend fellowship. We choose to use the word suspend rather than terminate because we wanted to use the less harsh term, hoping that Missouri will return. And the irony is Missouri brought us in to a doctrinal or confessional, with Walther's gospel, brought us in, and now we were hoping at the same time that Missouri would see this and come to and not allow this to happen, that we would be the one now bringing them back to doctrinal confession and unity. Standing at another microphone, Warner's brother Martin, the Missouri Synod pleaded for more patience. So you see those 2 pictures, those are brothers that are going to end up in different synods. To be always right is not the ultimate grace. And they're basically saying, show some mercy. Because we're not right in a few things, don't depart from us. And he's saying, you're not showing grace to us, is what the plea was. With much emotion, by the count of 124 to 49, the Wisconsin Synod voted to break fellowship with Missouri. And that 100 years of togetherness ended. 2 years later, the Wisconsin Synod voted to withdraw from the Synodical Conference, and 25-year battle to preserve the chair's fellowship had been lost. What will become of this little Wisconsin Synod? And this is something else that happened right after that, not too long. The wake of the break of Seminex. Many of the professors of the LCMS institutions, especially the seminary at St. Louis, cast doubt on divine inspiration and inerrancy of Scripture. The reason that happened is they were going outside of their fellowship for advanced degrees and doctorates and different things, and some of the secular teaching and the secular question, the dissecting, it was a different approach to Scripture, to a different approach to archaeology, and they were coming back with just questions on Adam and Eve and creation, days of creation, how this all came to be, and they were bringing this into the classroom. And they finally were called out saying, you are not teaching creation and the biblical, this has to be as Scripture says. And you're teaching things that are coming from classrooms that were not religious in nature. And they had a walkout on that campus, and it alarmed some conservative LCMS leadership. They attempted to reform, and they say, this is getting into our classrooms, which means there's a generation of pastors that went out with this teaching in front of the people, because they're taking what their professors said, and they're teaching the people. They see this, this is a big deal. In protest, some 500 students and 40 of the 45 professors at Concordia State to walk out. Many left to form Seminex, which was the seminary in exile. And so there was a big dividing, even in how they trained their pastors. The wake of the break, a few WELS congregations left to join the LCMS. That was kind of what happened with they had to make decisions as congregations. However, many LCMS congregations and pastors became alarmed by liberalization of doctrine in their synod and left. The Federal for Authentic Lutheranism, FAL, formed in the 70s, and then quickly grew to over 20 congregations that eventually peeled in to fellowship back with the Wisconsin Synod. By the end of the 70s, the congregations decided to join either with Wisconsin Synod or the Evangelical Lutheran Synod. And around here, there's a lot of ELS congregations, especially in Madison, that we were always been in unity with them too, which our two synods work together. In fact, the ELS has their directory for pastors and schools in our synod directory. We print it jointly. So what were the major developments? And it's sad that I'm going through this in like 14 minutes. It was a big thing. WELS resolved that the discussion was necessary, even if painfully difficult. Liberal theology in the LCMS led to civil war that sadly still has not been fully resolved, and WELS gained a number of faithful theologians and congregations from the LCMS. So what can we learn? One of the things I just say, in our last Synod convention, the current president of LCMS said in front of the convention floor, and everyone started clapping, was, you should have broken with us. That what you did was correct. And he's saying that Harrison said that, and everyone's like, but he goes, but we're working hard, and we've had better talks, and we're not there yet. There's a lot to talk about, but it's been interesting to see. In my lifetime, I've seen we are closer to LCMS and the need for doctrinal unity than we've been in a long time. And discussions with, when we have an interdenominational, inter-church relation, we have people that do this. They go to each other's conventions and listen and talk and discuss, because our goal is doctrinal unity and doing work that God has given us to do in the kingdom. A lot of history. Sorry, we're cranking through years, but challenges lead to blessings, and so it pushed us to expand home missions and world missions, to stand on our own 2 feet with publications and all these things too. And we are the ones that get to receive some of these blessings and continue on into the future. Let's just end with this prayer. Dearest Lord, thank you for this history where you led your people back to your word. And in so many conflicts that were global and national and even interdenominational, Lord, you lead us back to the one truth that we can count on. It's your truth to us. May we always stand on it and in it, and may we together, united by doctrine and what we believe in Jesus Christ, be the church today that has that same zeal to take the message we know well and get out with it to as many as we can while you give us time. We pray this all in Jesus' name. Amen.